All right, so our first big idea, a quick look at stats. We already talked about our disclaimers, right? So if you're dealing with these issues and you've got some medications you're taking, work with your physician, etc. Ideally, find one who's grounded in a nutritional philosophy that makes sense. Remember, your doctor's had about 18 hours of nutritional study in his or her education. So unless they've invested more time in it and you've read a few books on nutrition, you have a deeper perspective on nutrition and how it impacts your body than your physician. So God bless our institutional medical practices, and standard of care is not accounting for some very important variables that we need to take personal responsibility for. We don't want to be patients submitting to our physicians. We want to be conquerors, taking responsibility for our own well-being, realizing what strengths and weaknesses exist within different institutions, and doing what we need to do. It's our zero disclaimer. But you can see radical changes quickly, so do pay attention to that. Again, our first big idea, the stats. Why are we paying attention to this? Because it's a huge, huge issue. 600 million people are obese around the world. 2 billion people are overweight. $47 trillion will be spent over the next 20 years, according to the World Economic Forum, on diseases created by our global industrial diet, which is driven by 10 companies. Think about this for a second. Apparently, 90% of the food produced in the world is produced by 10 different companies. If we want to change the world, we each need to vote with every dollar we spend. The reality is most people aren't going to change their behaviors. They're going to do what their doctors tell them to do. They're going to do what just is ubiquitous throughout the world. We need to see these stats, realize that it's insanity and that it's no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society and do something about it. Longer chat we'll have throughout today's discussion. And then those are our global stats. Let's personalize it. How are you doing in relationship to those stats? Do you fall into one of those categories? Or how about a third, the obese, the overweight? A third category is overfat, is a phrase or a word that Phil Maffetone uses to describe individuals who are not technically overweight or obese, but they carry enough fat to jeopardize their health, right? So they fall in a normal health range, but they actually have more fat than would be healthy, would be optimal, and lead to some health risks, etc. So anyway, personal stats. The number one stat that we need to pay attention to is essentially our waist. Robert Lustig, UCSF endocrinologist, tells us this is the number one piece of health data that's the greatest predictor of your morbidity, your disease risk, predictability. You want to look at your risk for having different diseases. Look at your waist size, your waist circumference. He says for men, if it's over 40 inches, you fall into that risk category. Women, over 35 inches, you fall into that risk category. Phil Maffetone uses a different measure, which other scientists use, which is your waist to height ratio. And he says you want that to be 0.5 or less. So for example, measure your waist, then look at your height and divide the two, right? So I'm 6 feet tall, I'm 72 inches tall. Now, if my waist circumference was over 36, which is a more conservative measure than Robert Lustig's, who was 40 inches, if I'm over 36, according to this measure, I'm going to fall into some vulnerability, right? Now, I happen to be a 32-inch waist, so I'm fine, right? Less than 0.5. Do the math on your personal stats, and know, again, this is the most important measure. Robert Lustig says that we can have big butts or big bellies. And he says you want to have a big butt more than you want to have a big belly. If you've got a big butt, he says this is Marilyn Monroe's shape came from this type of fat. It's called subcutaneous fat. And he says actually the data shows that type of fat can lead to a longer lifespan than not. That's subcutaneous fat that's kind of spread evenly throughout your body. Where we need to get concerned more is with visceral fat, right? That's what big belly fat is called, and technically visceral fat that shows up right around your midsection. That's dangerous, and that's the easiest way to predict, again, your morbidity, disease risk, etc. We want to pay attention. But the point of this idea is, how are your personal stats vis-a-vis the global stats? If we're at risk or someone you love is at risk, we want to take care of this. It may not seem like a big deal, right? And unfortunately, it'd be fantastic if metabolic dysfunction immediately created results. If you ate something and you immediately had a reaction, well, it'd be easy to make the connection. Well, this leads to that. Unfortunately, these poor decisions take years and decades to aggregate. And once you get through that process and you're 20, 25 plus years out, or whatever it winds up being, it's really hard to reverse it. And most people need that sledgehammer to wake up. We want to be able to wake up at the tickle of a feather, is how one of my mentors put it many years ago. So there you go. Let's let the tickle, or wherever you are on that spectrum, wake us up to the reality that we got to affect change to our metabolism if we want to reach that optimal weight, have our optimal energy, etc.